First is that I want to offer a word of thanks to everybody who helps make this program run every time we gather. To Nash on the catering side of things, to my colleagues on the maintenance and facilities side of things, and a special thank you to a member of the book club, Rosalie White, who has done a wonderful job helping me line up our reviewers and helping to select our books and films for this year. So to Rosalie, we say a big toda rabba, a big thank you. And if any of you are interested in also helping next year to work with myself and Rosalie in a volunteer capacity on this program, please let me know, and we'd love your assistance. Couple of things programmatically just to let you know about. Shavuot is starting on Sunday night. And we'd love for you to join us for any or all of the following three things that I want to tell you about. On Sunday evening, June 1st, at the beginning of Shavuot, we have our annual Tikkun Leil Shavuot Night of Learning, which will feature various learnings from members of the Beth Tzedec spiritual leadership team, including myself. We will be continuing our theme for the year that we introduced at the High Holidays of Am Echad Lev Echad, one people, one heart, and talking a bit about what it means in this particular moment of Jewish peoplehood, the opportunities and the challenges of fulfilling that vision and that statement. So we have that beginning at 7:30 on Sunday evening, carrying through until just after midnight, which is when we'll conclude. On the first morning of Shavuot, Monday morning, June 2nd, we're going to be honoring three very special people here at the congregation. We're going to be honoring Rabbi Robin Fryer-Bodzin, who just received her honorary doctorate of divinity, celebrating 20 years since graduating rabbinical school. We're going to honor Rabbi Lara Roden, who just graduated from the Jewish Theological Seminary last week. And we're going to honor our own Aviva Chernik, celebrating and recognizing her transition into being the new full-time director of our Center for Spiritual Well-Being. We're also going to honor all of the babies born in the community in the past year, and that's all happening the first morning of Shavuot, June 2. And then June 3, the second day of Shavuot, is our annual Yasher Koach Awards, where we honor approximately 15 volunteers in the community who have made an impact this past year through being tremendous volunteers and giving of themselves to Beth Tzedec. So that's what's happening on Shavuot. If you want on your way out, you can take a picture with Theodore Herzl over by our Kotel installation. To be perfectly honest, before we had signage up saying he was there, he sort of caught you by surprise, just standing there in the corner, looking stern and cross-eyed, like he was doing security. But you can go and take a picture with Theodore, and right next to him is information about signing up for the World Zionist Congress elections, which are taking place in Canada between June 5th and 15th. An opportunity every 5 years for the global Jewish community to have a voice on the allocations of dollars to key Israeli and global Jewish institutions. There are billions of allocations of dollars that go on here, and the opportunity for you to have a voice in how those dollars are spent. There's information about the slate that Beth Tzedec is encouraging you to support, and how to get information for signing up to vote at that time. Two other things just to share, and then I'll introduce Jill. One is that our next year's Book and Film Club program is starting again in September. There will be information that you'll have by the end of June as to how to register, what the books are, so on and so forth. So please keep an eye out for that. But over the summer, we have a very special book event that we have just confirmed, which is that the author Daniel Silva is going to be here. He has a new book coming out this summer, and we are going to be his Toronto book launch stop. So on Sunday afternoon, July 27th at 4 p.m., he will be here, he will be speaking about his book, he will be in conversation about his book and his work, and he'll be signing books afterwards. So please keep an eye out for registration information that should launch by end of week, if not early next week, and have the chance to come out and meet and hear from a really fantastic and well-regarded international bestseller. So that's all of my announcements. Today we're very happy that Viva Thornhill Woods has sponsored the review and the gathering today. Jill from Viva is here, who many of you have met. And Jill, I want to give you a chance just to say a few words to the group before we draw for the raffle.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We're really happy to be here. So just a little bit about Viva Thornhill Wood. So we are a Jewish retirement community. We offer both independent living and assisted living, a little bit north on Bathurst. So we're just north of Rutherford, right across from the Schwartz-Reisman Center. And we also do respite care, short-term stays. So if you do want any information, I will be here. So, come and see me. But we are going to be giving away a beautiful orchid today. So we will just, Daniel, if you want to do it, so I don't pick any favorites.
Sure. Okay, let's do this one. Phyllis Miller. Congratulations. You're welcome. Thank you. We're appreciative of you being here, Jill, and of Viva's support of this program. Those are for you. And finally, let me introduce our reviewer this afternoon, Janna Nadler. We're so glad to have you with us. Janna holds a PhD in English literature and has taught over the years at University of Toronto and McMaster. Janna also, for over 15 years, has been speaking at various book clubs around the greater Toronto area and has spoken here in the past, I believe, but not for a little while. So we're thrilled to have you back to discuss the novel Fervor by Toby Lloyd. So Janna, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, I want to just grab my book. Let's make a nice display, not my coat lying here. How about this? At some point, I'm going to refer to the book, so I want it there. I don't know if we have any live streamers that he wanted to stream to, but maybe. Oh, I see it's at the back. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much for having me. Beth Tzedec has a special place in my heart, especially now that you have Rabbi Fryer, because she's a childhood friend from USY, and that's very nice for me to be back here. Can you hear me okay? You want me to closer? How's that? Okay, good. But it's blocking my eyesight, so let's try again. Okay, how's that? I'm very short, I know that. All right, so I'm going to start by saying that I haven't reviewed, until Fervor, I hadn't reviewed a Jewish book in quite some time. It had been about 5 years ago that I had selected as one of my seasons a Jewish book. And to be honest, I'm not even really sure what it means to call a book Jewish. And what's more, it kind of feels uncomfortable these days to do so, sort of like singling it out in an inappropriate way, maybe, because while the book has Jewish characters and a Jewish author and even a Jewish star on its cover, is it okay to define it as such and thereby exclude or maybe diminish the actual substance of the book, which I would argue is wider and broader than the label Jewish would imply? These days, I think that we are prompted to question how, when, why, and whether we should be defining anyone or anything within the overarching framework of religion, race, gender, and more. Because, as we know by now, identity is more flexible and fluid than those sorts of frameworks allow. It may be that this sort of defining, of pinning down, of framing, of restricting, of labeling, of judging does more harm than good. And yet, I'm feeling conflicted here, because these days, it takes a certain measure of courage to say, I am Jewish, to publicly wear a Magen David, to put it on the cover of your book, to publicly read and discuss a book with a Jewish star on its cover. A book which examines post-Holocaust anti-Semitism on campuses and which is therefore inextricably linked to Israel-Palestine rhetoric and conflict. So, it's a lot. It's uncomfortable. It's a lot. So why did I bring this book to you? How and why is this the chosen one of the chosen ones for the Janna Read season? Why now, after not reviewing a Jewish book in quite some time? Why this, with its dysfunctional family members, its crazy and unlikable characters, its seemingly critical depictions of Orthodox Jewish characters? So I will get there to those questions, but question first, the why now question. And my answer to the why now is that, in a way, the rise in anti-Semitism, which has sprung out of and is undeniably linked with anti-Zionism, made me feel that I needed to examine my identity, to take my scholarship more personally, to get in there with those Jewish characters and to know that I understand them in a way maybe that Gentiles do not and cannot know and understand them. So for example, maybe you, along with me, didn't necessarily need Lloyd's explanations of the Sabbath, like we know what the Sabbath is, of what a Sabbath goy is, of Shabbat dinners, when he describes the anglicized and Hebraic pronunciations of Hannah's name, the descriptions of the white kittel and when it's worn, the stone at the grave, the fact that Eric would not cremate his father, Yosef. I know about unfortunately observing Shiva. I could hear with Tovia when the Oxford professor mispronounces the word shoichet as shoshit. I went to Hebrew school and a Jewish youth group. We acted out the Sedra scenes. I know the stories of Dinah and Yiftach, or Jephthah. As an English literature teacher who's taught Hamlet year over year for 17 years, I also know that Hamlet calls Polonius Jephthah and what that refers to. And I know about golems and Gehinnom. I know about Orthodox Jewish matchmaking in the lobby of a hotel. Thank you to Eliza Ben Shalom from Netflix and Jewish matchmaking. I know, of course, about the Holocaust and the Jewish police and the Sondor Commando. And I'm sure many of you also had this breadth of knowledge as you came to this book. On top of all of that, by the way, my father was a hippie and a Kabbalah teacher, so I knew about the Ein Sof and the names of God and Isaac Luria and more. So I didn't know everything, but what I'm trying to say is that I felt at home here with this book, like I could find my way confidently and judge the characters and what they do and say. And I wanted to dwell in that familiar setting where I know what's what and who's who. But there's more, because with that feeling of familiarity comes the opportunity and the desire to compare myself to the others, to the characters, right? To consider, what would I do and say if I was in their shoes? And maybe you were experiencing some of that as well. And in doing so, this book had me striving to understand myself better and to make connections with those fictional others, with those characters. And I think it is human to strive to be understood and to seek self-knowledge, and Toby Lloyd taps into this human imperative with fervor. And in particular, Lloyd reminds us also that the flip side of this human imperative to know and be known is unreliability and unknowability. Okay, so we have points of view and perspectives with no definitive truth or certainty. And in one of his interviews, Lloyd calls this theme that he has in the book the perils of perspective. Okay, so he's dealing with the perils of perspective. And even, I want to say, in the opening inscription, which is about the Baal Shem Tov, it's a little story about the Baal Shem Tov, he supports this theme of the perils of perspective. And so what he writes in that opening inscription is the following. When the Baal Shem Tov was near his death, a student came to him with a written book and said, "These are your words which I have written down. This is the Torah of Rabbi Israel." The master read what was written and said, "Not one word of this is my Torah." And so what's the lesson here? Maybe that even a book which is fixed in print, which has taken, quotes from the Baal Shem Tov in this case, is unreliable, is uncertain. And we have another very good case in point when it comes to fervor for the perils of perspective. And what I'm talking about is the public in-print description and categorization of this book, Fervor, which I would say is highly contestable. So if you had gotten this book list and you had looked up Fervor, but you didn't actually read it at the time, or you just looked up to see what it was about, you might see that it was categorized as a Jewish book, but it was also categorized and billed in the press and with all the summaries under the genre of horror fiction. It was called horror. If you look it up, you see imagery of like a woman on flames, okay, in flames. You would see horror imagery. And that's the genre they are calling it. The plot is described as a Jewish family who discovers their daughter is a witch. And what I have to say to that is no. That is not this book. So if you haven't read it yet, and that's what you thought this book was about, that's untrue. That's not this book. It's not even close. No one discovers that Elsie is a witch. She is the victim of rumors at school. She keeps a lot of secrets. And her mother, Hannah's book, which, by the way, is filtered through Kate's perspective, says that Hannah believes that her daughter's a witch, but we also know that Hannah believes that she is receiving messages from God. So is that perspective reliable? I might say no to that. Hannah, the writer, has an agenda. She likes selling books and being famous, okay? Is she reliable? I don't know. She's got an agenda, and she believes she receives messages from God. And by the way, her perspective is filtered through, as I mentioned, Kate, who thinks she sees the ghost of Yosef, but does she actually? We will never know. And so we have like a double layer of unreliability here. So do we discover Elsie as a witch? Certainly not. And is this book really in the genre of horror? It doesn't feel that way to me, but just to be sure, I looked up the top 10 horror fiction books, just in case. And what I found was, I think, what you would expect. Dracula, Frankenstein, The Exorcist, Misery, The Shining, to name a few. Now, those books all have clear and undeniable supernatural elements. Okay, the tension springs from an explicit physical and psychological, but physical threat of some kind. And Fervor isn't quite that. Maybe it is a little bit. It's a horror in the same way maybe that Stephen King's book and movie Carrie is a horror, except Fervor doesn't have the explicit, undeniable supernatural abilities. Okay, so here are the crossovers. Carrie, like Fervor, has a touch of horror. Most of the story is about high school bullying, for example. Fervor also has that element of teen bullying, of mean girls, and it certainly has a theme of fitting in when it comes to Kate and Tovia. And there is that horrific scene of destruction of Elsie's self-immolation at the end. But unlike with Carrie, where we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that she possesses supernatural powers, with Elsie, Lloyd leaves a lot of room for doubt, right? Yes, there are rumors about Elsie's powers, and Hannah writes in her book that she believes that Elsie is communing with the dead. But this is Hannah, and is she reliable? No. Yes, there are people at the sanatorium who claim to have seen Elsie levitate, but they're people at a sanatorium, okay? There are teen girls who claim that Elsie's stories come true, but they're teen girls and they're mean teen girls, right? At one point, Hannah catches a glimpse of Ariel, and she believes that he might be some kind of golem or familiar. Kate claims that she's seen a godly light and the ghost of Yosef, and she's seen Elsie making a vase crack with her mind. But I think Lloyd leaves a lot of room for the skeptics, Tovia being the primary one of them, okay? And I think Therefore, Lloyd opens the door to reasonable doubt, very reasonable doubt, because this book cannot be filed in with the horror genre fiction. It's not our focus here. That's a red herring. The focus of Fervor, the central stress and tension upon which we need to focus, is, in my opinion, the story of a dysfunctional family. Is there any other kind of family? Falling apart, okay? Fervor reminds me much more of Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections than of Stephen King's Misery. And it's also, by the way, Rothian. It's kind of like American Pastoral, but British, okay? And of course, it is also biblical. It has a biblical tenor to it. And it has allusions to a number of biblical or like biblical adjacent stories. Remember, the opening words of this book are, "It is told." It's like very biblical, okay? And then the story launches into the scenes during which each of the 3 Rosenthal grandchildren go to see their grandfather Yosef on his deathbed. He's in the attic, right? And Tovia, the youngest and arguably the focus of this novel, goes third. He's the third child to go. And when he goes to see his grandfather, he wonders if he's about to see his Zeta die, but actually he knows he's about to receive his grandfather's parting gift, the great revelation, something he would carry with him through the course of his life. But this revelation he receives turns out to be disappointing and also maybe, I would say, difficult to interpret, okay? Difficult to interpret is another way of saying the perils of perspective. Right? So what is he told by his Zeta? Watch out for Elsie and Gideon. The second son protects the others, yes? Except if you think about what he's told, watch out for Elsie and Gideon, it has a double meaning, right? Is he supposed to be protecting his siblings from something? Or protect himself and others from his siblings? Watch out for Elsie and Gideon. Or watch out for Elsie and Gideon. I said the same words, but they're opposite perspectives, all right? So already from the beginning of the book, first with that inscription referencing the Baal Shem Tov, and now with that opening scene of this novel, Lloyd leads us to consider the perils of perspective and interpretation. We have to do that, all right? He reminds us that this is what we base our life on, right? And he also does this, I would argue, first and foremost, through the narrative perspective that he designs for this book. All right, so Lloyd derived inspiration for his narrative form, the point of view, which is told mostly from Kate's perspective, from books such as The Great Gatsby. Books which have a narrator. In The Great Gatsby's case, the narrator is named Nick Carraway. Okay, who is an onlooker, who's not part of the main family, who's not the main charismatic character. He's like a side character observing the title main character, right? And in an interview, Lloyd says, the stories about the Rosenthal family, they're the interest. They're what the story's really about. I knew I wanted an outsider to tell their story. And you know, I felt that Nick Carraway Gatsby vibe as soon as Kate made herself known. Except I think that while Lloyd deliberately has her flying under the radar, she is a fascinating character. Tovia calls her interesting and curious. He refers to the way you sit there listening, taking everything in, not saying much. And Tovia is right. Kate may present as the unbiased witness at a distance, right? But she's really the opposite. And so I think you know what that means, that she may present as a reliable, unbiased narrator, but she is really an unreliable and biased narrator, okay? And I want to remind you of something that Tovia says or yells at the end of the novel when they're all in his house, in his childhood home, and Kate is there too, and he says, there are no reliable narrators in this house. Same, right? We're getting notation from Lloyd. So here we are, back with the perils of perspective and interpretation. Dear Kate, How is she unreliable? Let us count the ways. One of the first things we learn about her is that she's trying to fit in socially, right? She's hanging out with Jan and Carrie and Ruby, and she's saying, to be accepted by such people outstripped every social aspiration I'd ever had. She didn't have that experience in high school. When she goes to college, she's got a friend group, and she wants to be accepted, right? What does a person do in order to be accepted into a social group? Are they true to themselves? Are they authentic? No. They're pretending, they're following, they are conforming, okay? So we can't necessarily trust her outside appearance and behavior. And we can dig deeper. We can talk about Kate's sort of Jewish identity, sort of, quote unquote, right? She's been raised non-Jewish, and then she finds out, along with her father, that he was Jewish. And so now she is curious. She is exploring. She is invested in, not detached from, the Rosenthals' religious observance, or lack thereof. She begins attending synagogue, learning about Jewish culture. She's mentioned she likes the friendly liberal Jews, but she's wondering if the old bearded Jews, bearded men, have some ancient wisdom. She comments that to the Orthodox, nothing was just a metaphor. And most importantly, and central to this narrative, she is witnessing this other family, the Rosenthals, and she's feeling affinities, right? She is measuring her own faith up against theirs. And speaking of faith, how about that time when Kate realizes she has seen a ghost? Tobias Zeta wearing his burial robe and tallis. Now, in another book, I might just call it magic realism. But Tovia denies seeing him. So maybe, again, unreliable narrator. Maybe it's Kate we need to think about. And then there is the time when Kate feels the presence of God. A light emanating out from under Tovia's door. She gets on her knees and traces it, thinking, I knew then with absolute certainty that there is a God who created the universe, a fog at the center of the flame, just as I knew that I loved Tovia and I loved his sister also, that even though one of them was confrontational and difficult and the other I barely knew, I loved them both with a kind of selfless love that would last as long as I lived and perhaps beyond. The way God loves, God who created each and every one of us, who knows all and has always been there, and who watches over everything forever. That does not sound like a detached observer to me. Not only has Kate seen the light and had a revelation from God, or I don't know, maybe she can't hold her liquor, you might recall, she's very drunk at the time, but she's also in love with Tovia, an unrequited love, I might add. She's obsessed with Tovia. And right after she sees the light, by the way, she also says that Elsie has summoned God's light and that Hannah's children were celebrating his glory together. And she says, I felt a happiness so intense I thought I might pass out. So, what's going on with Kate? She here in that scene is religiously fervent, like Hannah, and possibly mentally unstable, like Elsie, and she is hung up on Tovia. Unreliable narrator seems so to me, but I want to say I like Kate. I'm not putting her down because she's unreliable. I like her. I like what Lloyd does with Kate. Her interest in the Rosenthals is what keeps me, the reader, interested, and her unreliability makes it more interesting even than it was before. So there's this part where Hannah's book is published and Kate comments on her fascination with it. All right, and she uses an analogy. She says, when you drive past an upturned car, you don't look away, especially when you know the passengers. And she's talking about the book, how she knows the characters, the people that Hannah's describing in her book. That is true, right, with that analogy. And that is what she's doing. But it's also what I, and maybe you, are doing as a reader, twice removed, and still in it, invested, thinking about who I should believe and where I stand. Because these characters are familiar to me, and because I'm seeing through Kate's perspective. And so I have to admit that although he is socially awkward and annoying and has no friends, I find myself agreeing with Tovia's stance a lot of the time. I don't think that's by accident, it's by design. I think the reader's alignment with Tovia is not surprising if you had that alignment. After all, the main character, Kate, feels the pull. There is something in Tovia which attracts her to him, which fascinates her. And I think that Toby Lloyd also casts Tovia in his image. So in your packets, I give you some details about the author, which you may have glanced at, right? First of all, is it a coincidence that Toby's name has the same root letters as Tovia's? I can't say for certain. I tried to tweet Toby Lloyd. He didn't reply to me so far as I know, but I don't think it's a coincidence. Tovia also, like Toby Lloyd, is an atheist, okay? And he's exploring how a child lives through that kind of internal conflict, where you can't be true to yourself and you perceive your family members as deluded. You're being raised by family members who believe in God and you don't, right? As Lloyd says in an interview, part of what the novel is about is a thought experiment of imagining people who don't want to be part of that community, but are born into it. And that's what Tovia's character is, a misfit within the family he's born into. So this story gives us some idea of Tovia's agony, the problem of being brought up with God, which in his mind is nothingness, which he sees as insane. Made to wrap tefillin round his wrists and forehead each morning while he repeated words he didn't believe in a language he barely spoke. And this has led to Tovia's rage and pushed him to the, quote, fringes of his sanity. And so finally he comes out to his family and he tells them, I don't believe in God. There is no Yahweh, no nothing, just nothing. And then he yells at them, nothing, 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 nothing. And through Tovia's skepticism, Lloyd makes a pretty good case for atheism, I think, through that book, through Tovia's skepticism. Plus, he gives us some humor because God isn't Tovia's only problem. As he finishes high school, he's got two big problems, God and girls, the problem being neither of them exists for Tovia. So maybe I think ultimately I just like Tovia's fervor the best. And I think we know by now that all of our main characters in this book have a main fervor. What do I mean by fervor? A main organizing principle or prime directive or obsession of some kind. So Hannah's is her faith and maybe also her ambition as a writer. Kate's is Tovia. And Tovia's, it's not God, it's not popularity or social life, it's not ambition. I would say it's academics, it's book learning, it's rational thought. Remember, his room isn't decorated. All it has in it is books. Think of his reaction to his mother's books, which are this strange blend of fiction and creative memoir and journaling maybe. And to Tovia, her books are as ridiculous as his parents' faith in God. At one point, he's talking to Kate about his mother's ideas about Elsie and about his Zeta. And he says it all comes from the transmutation of senseless events into linear narrative. Elsie's life is not a sequel to Zeta's. That's marketing. That's bullshit. Elsie's life is like anyone else's. It's chaotic and messy, and it doesn't fit into 3 acts. Now, Tovia's argument, rationally speaking, is sound. We humans attempt to make meaning out of chaos. We know the chaos exists, but we still want meaning. We want to define and shape and frame our lives, our identities, and others' lives and selves too. And this is, by the way, exactly what storytelling does. It shapes, it constructs a narrative. When we write or read a story, we engage in the process and the act of meaning making and meaning shaping. And that is very powerful. And that is why and how words are powerful and perception shapes reality and identity in self and other. To quote Shakespeare's Hamlet, There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, right? So when we read Fervor and other good literature, other stories, we encounter, we engage with meaning making, with story shaping. In Fervor in particular, we encounter conflicting perspectives on God, on faith, on this Rosenthal family, and thinking about all of those perspectives prompts us to align and compare and contrast ourselves with those perspectives. So what are we engaging in? An existential pursuit, right? We are thinking about how we exist in the world, how we identify ourselves and others. We refine and reconfirm our understandings of ourselves according to what we think of Tovia, of Janna, of Kate. And what we think of those three characters, I would argue, is based primarily on their perceptions and treatment of Elsie. So, while I would say that the novel's main character is Tovia, I would also say that all characters, including Tovia, are circling around Elsie, trying to make meaning of her, to shape her life into a story, to understand her. As Lloyd alludes to in one of his interviews, Elsie is the source of his family's tragedy, and he says any effort to make complete sense of it is bound to fail. No one is ever going to get an answer that will completely satisfy them, and that's the underlying pain that exists for this family. And because Janna is famous, Elsie's character and her disappearance and reappearance has this broader fascination and appeal even. So I want to start by saying Elsie isn't your typical teen girl with a coming of age, which is typical. She doesn't just have the typical angst and rebellion that you would encounter in a coming of age teen girl novel, right? Because added to the typical, which would be sex with an older boy, the beer and the weed, unfortunately also the anorexia and the cutting, are the more unconventional elements of Elsie's teen rebellion. Namely, reading Hasidic tales and the lesser-known Bible stories and the Kabbalah. Those you don't come across very often. There's also that stone from Zeta's funeral, which is kind of a talisman, maybe. So narratively speaking, also, I wanted to mention that stone because I think we circle around Elsie and the book holds on to her sort of like Elsie holds on to that stone, okay? You can think about it in those terms symbolically. She's both tangible, real, and symbolic, intangible. She is both a girl and a ghost, all right? Think of Kate's first glimpse of Elsie. It's at college. Tovia's family catches her eye, and she notices a third figure, and she thinks to herself, no more than a child, fiddled with the drawstrings of her white hoodie, her face concealed. So Kate has to revise that first impression of Elsie, because she sees that this was not a child, but a young woman, at least in her 20s. Her hand was still locked in the man's grip, and she thinks to herself, that's how you walk with a little girl. So Elsie is a girl, but not a girl, right? Kate thinks she's a little girl, but then realizes she isn't. And by the way, what color was she wearing? A hoodie, which is white. And I don't think that's an accident. White is symbolic of purity and innocence, but also of death and mourning, right? The kittel is the white robe worn by a Jewish man on his wedding day, on the high holidays, and as his burial shroud. Kate sees the ghost of Zeta, Yosef Rosenthal, in a kittel. Take off the dust jacket of this novel. The book's white. That's not usual, by the way. I don't think when you unwrap other hardcover books, many of them are white. Okay? And we'll hold on to that for a little while. Back to Elsie, the girl who disappears for 4 harrowing days of not knowing. Days during which Janna appeals to the world. Lloyd comes at this piece of the story in a very interesting way because he leaves us hanging for a bit, right? He sets up the 3 children and the family, and then Zeta passes, and then Janna comes home one day and Eric tells her, Elsie's missing. And then Lloyd moves on to Kate's life at Oxford, and he circles around the story from an outsider's perspective as this juicy piece of gossip from Tovia's past. So Kate's friends are gossiping about it. They're letting Kate in on the gossip. They're recalling how Janna went on national television saying God would save her daughter. And between the three of them, Kate's friends, they have conflicting stories of what happened to Elsie. So one of them says, oh, I remember her being dead in a ditch. And one of them says, no, she's still missing. And one of them says, no, I read she came home on her own. And then we, the readers, later kind of maybe even miss it, but Kate casually mentions to us that she looked up Elsie's story. And she tells us hers was not a horror story ending. Within a few days of leaving home, she was found alive and well. Whether she was abducted or ran away was not clear from the information I found online, says Kate. And eventually, we do get some details of the leading into and the aftermath of those 4 days, but there is no definitive answer to what exactly happened to Elsie. We read no therapist could get her to open up. So we get some details from Elsie's life afterwards. She's diagnosed with depression. She is expelled from school for antisocial behavior. She's kicked out of 2 more schools for stealing and bullying. At one point, she tears up a Tanakh and she says she hates God. She kills the neighbor's chickens, apparently. She writes a blog post claiming that her Zeta was a sort of wizard, a powerful Kabbalist who evaded Nazi persecution through ancient mystical techniques. And she writes, even now, his spirit outwitted oblivion and could still be seen around the house. She has a breakdown. She walks barefoot on broken glass. At age 16, she has life-threatening anorexia. She's hospitalized. She has attempted suicide. And as a young adult, she is medicated and she is back and forth between parents and institutions, and she's an alcoholic. So, Elsie is problematic, to say the least. She is the kid in the family that demands your attention. The parents must focus on her to the exclusion of the others. And Lloyd says that in the novel, Elsie becomes a sort of battleground over which the other characters are fighting. How do you solve a problem like Elsie? The answer is you don't. There is no answer to this. Elsie cannot be fixed or solved. Elsie's favorite word for God, favorite name for God is Ein Sof, meaning endlessness, something utterly unknowable. Elsie is unknowable. And so what I think is that Elsie is the sounding board or the Rorschach test for the other characters and for us, the readers. We read about her and around her, and our perspectives on her align or conflict with the various narratives. She's a blank page or a blank cover of a book. So, we're reading about the other perspectives on Elsie. For example, Tovia concludes that Elsie is who she is because of brain chemistry and unlucky incidents in her life, plus bad parenting. He's, the reasonable one, the one who reasons it out. He thinks that his mother's notion of Elsie is nonsense and that her family has driven her insane. And especially after Elsie is missing and Eric's response is to pray and to fast, and Janna is checking for mistakes in the mezuzahs. Tovia says, I grew up in a madhouse. He thinks all of this is crazy. And we get Janna's perspective, on the other hand, who believes that there is a meaning, a spiritual dimension. She writes, if something was happening to her daughter and not to someone else's, then it was because that was what God wanted. Something had taken possession of her, some imp, some demon, some dybbuk, something that cared nothing for the well-being of my daughter, of my darling Elsie. And that is the thesis of Hannah's book, Daughters of Endor, which, by the way, Tovia debunks, right? He fact checks. He says, for example, that it would have been impossible for Elsie to be reading the Zohar at age 13 because it was written in Aramaic and she couldn't read Aramaic. So we've got Tovia's perspective on Elsie. We have Hannah's perspective on Elsie. We even get Gideon's perspective on her. He has a simple idea. Maybe there was a boy in it. And maybe that thesis or that idea or framing of Elsie comes closest to the truth, because we are told in a section of the book which seems to come from an omniscient narrator, or maybe Elsie's diary, or maybe Kate's speculations, that unknown to the rest of the family, Elsie's first romantic adventure began just days after her grandfather had been lowered into the ground, where she meets a boy, a sixth former at a nearby college, clattering around on his skateboard. He offers her a cigarette. She tells him she's 17 years old. She is not. His name is Carl. And we have the C referred to in her diary, right? And then for a few months, we read they made out in the dark of the cinema. What movies are they watching? Rosemary's Baby, Carrie. They're smoking joints. They're drinking beer. They're doing coke. And she's reading Hasidic legends and the Zohar. To Elsie, we read, who smoked her first cigarette at 11 and who would lose her virginity at 14, nothing was so inviting as a locked door, the object lifted beyond reach. And we read how she cultivated older friends, and she drank more heavily and more desperately than her peers, and she experimented, and she read crazy books, and she reached extraordinary heights, and she is fixated on death and what comes after. Her Zeta's past, right? And she wonders, why should she have to wait until everyone else caught up? By her age, Juliet had eloped and then killed herself. And she thinks about Zeta, who understood. He'd told her things children don't get told about the life of shadows and about Ariel. There was no one left who took her seriously, is how she feels. All right, so maybe Elsie's demise does have something simply to do with the boy and with her unusual coming of age. Maybe it has to do with the impact that her Zeta had on her, both in life and in death. But maybe not. I would say perhaps the scariest speculation of Elsie comes from Elsie herself. When she tells Tovia near the end of the book, what if I'm not ill and I'm not possessed? This is just how I am. Maybe I like everyone running around shit scared, all the attention, the total lack of responsibilities. And she tells him, I'm not an idiot. I do know what I'm doing. And then she laughs. And it's this conversation, by the way, which leads Tovia to realize that his idea about saving Elsie, like something out of a fairy tale, is impossible. And so in that moment, I realized Tovia is weirdly just the same as his mother. It's just that while his mother, thinks of Elsie as the witch, Tovia thinks of Elsie as the damsel in distress. And neither of those perspectives is realistic. And rescuing Elsie is impossible because she is a moving target. She is a puzzle with no solution. She is elusive, like a ghost, unreadable and impossible to grasp. Elsie is haunting this book just as much as, if not more, than Yosef is. And so I think it is fitting that Elsie becomes possessed with Yosef's spirit. That connection between Elsie and Yosef, overlaid with the visceral impact his life and death has on her, highlights to us, I think, the real question and problem of generational trauma and the generational trauma of inheriting that trauma. Okay, so going from generation to generation. And that trauma doesn't only arise from the loss of the patriarch of the family, of Zeta. The crack in the Rosenthal family isn't, I want to say again, just a result of his death, but also of his life and what he suffered in his youth. And it gets carried over into his children's and grandchildren's DNA, right? Into their psyches. Recall that before the first scene of the book with Zeta on his deathbed, Elsie spends loads of time with him, listening in on him, internalizing his stories, both directly and when she's not supposed to be listening to him, but she is anyways. So when it comes to being possessed by him, Elsie has a lot of source material. In addition to being, so he has a lot of trauma and feeling of being an outsider from even before the Holocaust. Who is he as a member of his family? He's the tone-deaf outsider in a family of musicians, pre-Holocaust. And then Yosef loses his mother, his father, his two sisters, and then his brother, before himself being transported to the death camp. And then he spends his time in the camp as part of the Sonderkommando, the special squad. He experiences unspeakable horrors, which lead him at the end of his life to tell his family, when I'm dead, don't stick me in the ground. Please set the body on fire. When people read about my life, I want to be dust and ashes. Destroy every piece of me, everything that's left. Now, at the time, child Elsie says that Zeta wants to be incinerated. She doesn't use the word cremated here. She says incinerated. And she's keeping that stone, which is meant for his grave. And it does seem that incineration, the word incineration, is more apt than cremation. Zeta wants to go the same way that he witnessed and probably participated in his people going, right? So Lloyd absolutely depicts Yosef at the personal, familial level to demonstrate the ways in which his family falls apart after Zeta's death. But in addition to that personal, familial level is the other fascinating conversation to be had about the morality of writing and remembering Holocaust narratives. And Lloyd gives us two layers to this, because not only do we have here a Holocaust narrative in a fictional novel, embodied in a fictional character, but we also have that Holocaust narrative retold by Janna against Yosef's will. Right? And Lloyd talked about this in an interview where he says that such a historically sensitive subject, one that doesn't want to, as the Holocaust, Lloyd says one doesn't want to tell lies about the Holocaust because the claim of fictionalization is obviously a big part of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. That's in part, he says, why I decided Yosef's narrative should be refracted through Janna, who hears Yosef's story and then relays it to us. Crucially, we don't have direct access to the experience through an omniscient narrator. Everything is blurred by time and the frailty of memory. So, that deliberate blurring of memory both reminds us of the problems with memory, right? The flaws in memory, and it solves for the ethical issue of a fictional Holocaust narrative. We're told of Yosef, often he contradicted himself. Sometimes he would say that no one knew anything about the camps. Sometimes everybody knew. So, we know he skirts the edges of his story. He doesn't talk about life in the camp, and yet kind of pushes on that bruise, right? She pushes him. She bullies him. Which leads to the ethical issues of Janna's book. Because not only do we read the excerpts of her book, they're double indented in the novel, but we also receive her justifications for having published it. So she comes up against Eric and Tovia, who are arguing that she shouldn't be writing this book and publishing this book. It does more harm than good to Yosef. It causes him unnecessary pain. But Janna determines that the work needed to be done. She was on God's path. And so even though he tells her clearly, no, this is my life, Janna, it's not your book, she does it anyway. She says he was wrong. History, be it yours, mine, or the next person's, belongs to us all, and that's what I told him. And so what are we doing as readers here? We are engaging with that, age-old question, do the ends justify the means? Is this for the greater good? Is there no copyright on a person's history? Lloyd has us contemplating how this familial personal dispute has those broader implications. And he also has us thinking about and possibly getting very upset with Janna Rosenthal, right? So I think most of us dislike the character of Janna Rosenthal. She's ambitious, but in a way which hurts her family. I think her ambition rubs us the wrong way. She is smart and successful, but she's also superstitious and inconsistently observant, and maybe that rubs us the wrong way. We read how as a young woman, Janna becomes observant after she has some kind of a feeling, a vision, a revelation that she's being watched over and that she's not alone. And she responds to this by going to a synagogue. And then later, as Janna is grappling with her daughter Elsie's mental illness, she goes on a walk. And what does she do? She asks God for the answers. She talks to God. She asks God, what am I supposed to do? And God replies, and he tells her strange truths about her daughter, truths that from any other mouth she wouldn't have believed. Okay? One of the things that God tells her is that Elsie has been summoning the spirits of the dead. So, Janna feels or believes that Yosef's soul is unmoored and is haunting them. And she writes everything: Elsie's disappearance, Gideon's confusion, Tovia's misery, everything stemmed back to her father-in-law's death. And what she publishes in her book, this so-called work of nonfiction, is that Elsie is a witch, a girl waylaid by demonic influences, a summoner of the dead. So, what do we make of Janna Rosenthal? For my part, I think her actions and her justifications make total sense for her character and what she is going through. Okay? So, there may be some of us in this room who are mothers of daughters or grandmothers of daughters who are struggling with mental illness, or maybe we know someone who's been through that. And I think if you have witnessed or experienced that firsthand, you know that you cannot stop thinking about it, but that you have very little control over it, over the fixing of your child, so to speak. And oftentimes, your perception of your child does not match the teacher's and the doctor's perceptions, and maybe you can't face and accept the evidence set in front of you. And I think if you're Janna Rosenthal and you're dealing with all of this, you ask God for the answers, and you already have faith and belief and fervor about God. And so if God told you the answer and gave you a reason, and you are Janna Rosenthal, and all you have to do is keep on believing, would it be so crazy to do so? Not for her, right? With some faith, she could have not only the comfort of God, but also find a reason for her child's agony, and that's what she does. So, would it be believable that this mother would do and feel this? I think yes. That's the character. That's what she does, and that's what she believes. Especially as we read in one of Kate's sections that Tovia's parents believed in the literal truths of the Old Testament, and that groundless belief could trump rational thought, we can apply that to Janna. So there is a criticism here of Janna, not of religious Jews necessarily, but rather of what happens when you're so fervorous that you abdicate blame and responsibility. When people shift the blame and responsibility of their futures and their fates and those of their loved ones and the world to solely God, that's what Lloyd is critical of. Lloyd is critical of any kind of fervor because it leads to blindness or tunnel vision and a denial of agency and responsibility. And I think if any of us know Orthodox Jewry, we know that these are critical individuals who do not say it is all up to God. They're very active in their futures, and they are questioning and interrogating, always. So, as we observed already, one of the themes of the book is the perils of interpretation. And so Lloyd has a line that's quoted towards the end of the book from a rabbinical sage who said that God is in everything, even in atheism. And why is God in atheism? Is because the atheist has to take responsibility. The atheist can't say it's up to God. They have to say it's up to me. And that's a form of goodness. And then Lloyd says, Janna, if you like, is the opposite of that. She is the believer who uses her belief to abdicate responsibility. Her attitude is, I don't have to sort things out because I am ultimately powerless. God is powerful. God will resolve things. So, again, Janna's fervor is cast in a critical light. And Lloyd admits that it's hard not to interpret that as an indictment against a highly observant life, but that he hopes that there is a kind of religious practice and religious faith that is divorced from that kind of dogmatic literalism. And he says, I hope that comes out in the novel. And he says that the problem is when you start saying that every word of it is the word of God, and that every word of it trumps everything that you might reason, that's when you get into the territory of having stances that are unjust. And layered over this critique of Janna's fervor is how this character, who is a writer, hurts others with her writing in order to serve her ambition whilst calling it justified. It's through Janna that Lloyd is therefore self-reflexive about writing, about the damage that it can do in real life to the people that you love. So recall back to that moment when Janna sees the police car approaching the outside of her house. What's she thinking? She's thinking they're there to tell her that Elsie's dead, right? And she feels in that moment, Eric was right, and I shouldn't have written that book about Yosef. And she thinks, you fix people in ink and you kill them, even if they're already dead, you kill them over. And she resolves never to write again, never to write one of those books again, right? So for a flash, she admits wrongdoing. She resolves never to write a book. But then, as we know, Elsie walks through the door, all is good, they can celebrate, and Janna can feed her writerly ambitions and receive answers from God once again. And I think to myself, why not? It seems, again, totally human and believable for Janna, this character, to pursue her writerly ambitions and to connect and justify her vocation and subject material to her faith. So, although we don't or may not like Janna, and perhaps the mothers in the room have an extra measure of distaste for her, she's not unrealistic either, as a mother or as a fervorous, flawed Jewish woman, right? What she's doing is serving as food for thought and a basis for self-comparison. And in fact, this entire novel, in its creative and beautifully crafted way, serves as a basis for self-comparison and self-definition, at least for the Jewish readers. But I think it goes beyond, because I have talked to non-Jewish readers. One of the elements of this Jewish family narrative, which I liked best, was its diversity of Jewish identity. All right, so we've got faithful, religiously observant Jews who believe in God, but who aren't perfectly observant. We have the Holocaust survivor and his descendants. We have modern Jewish characters living and working in secular society. We have spiritual, mystical Jews. We have Kate, who calls herself a sort of Jew, newly discovered on her father's side. And we have a new one for me, British Jews. There should maybe be a collective noun for Jews, like there is, for a gaggle of geese or a murder of crows or a fright of ghosts. And maybe there is. Maybe it's the same one that they use for monks, a congregation of monks or Jews. But then again, I don't know. It doesn't really sound right to have a collective noun for such a diverse group. Even just within the Rosenthal family, we have conflict and diversity. We have Yosef, the Holocaust survivor, Eric, the modern Orthodox father, Janna, the modern Orthodox Baal Tshuva mother, Tovia, who comes out as an atheist, Gideon, who is a don't ask, don't tell gay man and has made Aliyah. Elsie reads the Zohar and struggles with mental illness. This family is a microcosm of Jewish identity, devised as such, at least in part, in order not to pigeonhole Jews. Instead, I think as with Elsie, we readers find ourselves aligning with and defining ourselves against those individual characters and in terms of their Jewish identity. So you can think back. Were you situating yourself against or alongside certain characters? When Kate discovers that she's Jewish, and she identifies herself as Jewish, and we read, she's not born of a Jewish mother. Did you think twice about her self-identification as Jewish, right? Especially when she identifies herself as sort of Jewish, quote unquote. So you can think back to maybe the parts in the book where you were judging or comparing or, thinking about their identifications and their observances. In having diverse and complicated Jewish characters, Lloyd is deliberately exploring what it means to be a contemporary Jew. He says, I knew I wanted to write a very Jewish book, and I thought it was necessary that there would be multiple Jewish characters, so the book wasn't saying Jews are like this or like that. They are like people, like other people, various. And let's understand that while Lloyd presents varied examples of Jews, he doesn't answer the question of what it means to be a contemporary Jew. Instead, he poses the question, which is, of course, varied, diverse, and unanswerable, right? It's another Ein Sof, right? It's about, is it about having a Jewish mother or a set of shared cultural touchstones or a very specific relationship to history? He says it's a question I hope the book asks rather than answers. But I want to say, Lloyd doesn't just leave his consideration of Jewish identity there. He can't leave it there, because wrapped into Jewish identity, along with family and community, is, number one, the Holocaust. Number two, Israel, and number three, anti-Semitism. These three are inextricably linked. It doesn't even matter if the individual Jewish person wants to extricate themselves. They simply cannot do so. Example, Gideon, backpacking in Istanbul, tells no one he is Jewish, and still anti-Semitism presents itself when he's sitting at the dinner table and the very nice hosts and all of their guests all agree that the Jews are dogs, quote unquote, right? And this, incidentally, is why Gideon has made Aliyah in the first place. This isn't a boy he likes. He says, in Israel, nobody pushes you around for being a Jew. They walked tall, they built themselves up strong, and they kicked ass. Tovia, like Gideon, is schooled in the pervasive character of anti-Semitism in the diaspora. He describes at one point to Kate his Oxford interview, and she asks him, why didn't you report it as anti-Semitic? And he laughs and he says, no one cares about anti-Semitism. So Tovia may be pessimistic, but I don't think he's wrong. Even today, especially today, we can think of the whole lot of information coming out about DEI groups and offices, diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, and how they really aren't including Jews or anti-Semitism in their work. Nobody cares about anti-Semitism, to quote Tovia. And as we know, anti-Semitism is particularly rampant on campus. Even in Tovia's day, circa 2008-2009, he observed correctly that the majority of people will admire the anti-Semite and blame the Jew, will call the Jew a Nazi, and put a swastika on Tovia's door, right? Which is what happens as Kate puts it, when global events intruded on our university lives. What were those global events? The politics of Israel and Palestine. Janna says, you know the score. You want everyone to like you. Don't start talking about Israel-Palestine. But Janna does write about it. She talks about it. She writes about it. And so Tovia is targeted for his mother's politics. And he says to Kate, you want to know the ironic thing? I don't even like Israel, but that's of no consequence. And Lloyd understands this. And what he wanted to show in the novel was that if you are Jewish and you live in Britain or you live in America or you live in Canada, you can't completely ignore what is happening in Israel-Palestine, even if you want to, because other people won't let you. So even though this story is set 15 years earlier, Lloyd can use his characters' experiences of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism to, as he puts it, show an important part of Jewish identity. Whether he says you're a real Israel defender, whether you love the country or whether you can't stand it, it still somehow impacts you as a Jew in the West. To not write about it, therefore, would be to not present a full picture of Jewish experience in the UK. And although the story is a strange one, with some elements we perhaps aren't used to or comfortable with, Lloyd does exactly this, presents a full picture. That's why my talk is so long. Recall how Janna, in one of her book excerpts, describes the family home as a dollhouse, and as us looking into each room, at each doll. We, as readers, are going through every room in this house, so to speak. We play at being each of these dolls, these characters, and we witness their demise. When Zeta dies, Lloyd depicts the schism, the crack in the family, not only as a consequence of Yosef's death, but also a consequence of the decimation of his family tree in the Holocaust. These cracks, these schisms in his family are large and small, and they lead to tragedy. In fact, this story is bookended by death, cover to cover, Zeta to Elsie, whereby Elsie channels Yosef and fulfills his wish to be incinerated. On page 8, early in the story, Elsie uses that first word, incinerated, rather than cremated, and Tovia, who's too young to know what that word means, has a flash of something, of a vision, of the meaning of it. A black gate holding back terrible light, an orange glow, flames, the smell of ashes like after a barbecue. And there's an ironic circling back to the first few pages of the book, during which Gideon and Elsie and Tovia discuss how Zeta doesn't want to be buried under the ground, and Elsie smiles and answers, "Who does?" And we realize when we come to the end of this novel that that was a foreshadowing of how Elsie dies. So from beginning to end, there is a slow and steady turn of the screw. Or maybe it's a bit like Heart of Darkness, which takes the reader on a journey into a progressively more horrible and threatening world, ending in mental breakdown and death. And I guess if you've never read Heart of Darkness, maybe you never will now, sorry. But I would say that Fervor is first and foremost a psychological book about the impact and the power of faith and fervor. And it gets you thinking about which characters seem most reliable to you? Who are you most like? Who upsets you? Who challenges you? These characters teach us about ourselves. And so Fervor is also about the impact and the power of storytelling, right? Of impressing, for example, and exposing the horrors of the Holocaust on a young mind. And then it's about the breakdown of that young mind, which leads to the breakdown of the family going up in smoke. How darkly tragicomic that the final horrific scene begins with a family Shabbat dinner. Kate says, appending all my expectations, here was a warm, good-humored family, and tonight I was going to have fun. Well, it doesn't quite turn out that way. The evening takes a turn, shall we say. The vase at the center of this table, symbolic of the family, cracks in two. That vase reminds me of Henry James's The Golden Bowl. Tovia calls his family infectious. You only have to come near them to go straight out of your mind, he says. And he, recall, is planning a prison break for Elsie, but he realizes that he has misjudged the situation. Even Tovia, the rational pessimist, is human and can get caught up in a fairy tale for a time. Why? Because we seek solutions to the problems in our lives. Kate is woken by a loud noise and sees a weird glow, not the first weird glow she's seen in the story. The mirror on the main floor is cracked down the middle, not the first crack in the Rosenthal family home. And we read that in the center of the patio outside stood Elsie, bolt upright with her hands raised to the sky. She was dressed entirely in white. Eric sees Elsie burning. He howls and he literally pulls out his hair. This, if you don't recall, is an echo of a story that Tovia tells Kate when they first meet about his grandfather. So his grandfather told him a story, which he repeats, of having witnessed a bereaved widow pulling out her hair and rending her clothes, and then she takes the hair she's pulled out and hands fistfuls of that hair to his grandfather. And so what's happening here? Imagery, symbolism, the ripple effect of stories and past traumas carry over from front to back, past to future, generation to generation. But that's not the ending of the book. Years later, Kate tells how she saw Tovia, who had dropped out of Oxford and moved to Berlin. She sees him in a train station. He looks away. Is it Tovia? Isn't it Tovia? We don't know. Either Tovia pretends not to know Kate, or it is a case of mistaken identity. I guess you get to decide. I've already told you how I feel about Kate and her reliability. What she observes is that there was a mole to one side of his chin that I did not remember, that he talks in German. Kate says, sorry, she took him for someone else, to which he replies, good luck. Either way, this sighting of Tovia sparks memories of Elsie in Kate's mind. She gets to thinking about Elsie, of how we all failed this girl, of her short life as a passing shadow, no trace of which remains. And again, the scene on the train isn't the end, because there's an epilogue. There's a seemingly omniscient narration from Elsie's perspective about a girl whose shadow lengthened beside her, and she's on the Norfolk coast, and she's walking toward a windmill. And she's thinking of Ariel, and she's thinking of God's beauty, and she thinks of the Carls of the world, and she's in agony, and she thinks how being dead was okay. And so I had to think about this and contend with this epilogue and think, did I need it? Did I want it? Was it necessary? And at first I wasn't sure. And I also wasn't sure whose perspective it was. Was it Elsie's perspective? Was it Kate's speculation? What's it doing for this story? And my conclusion is that it is needed, and we have to have it, because what it does is it honors Elsie's memory. Otherwise, her final words are when she tells Tovia she knows exactly what she's doing and she's manipulating everyone. Here, in this epilogue, she is vulnerable. She is someone you want to protect. She's someone to mourn. She is a ghost and a girl at once here. And so, this story haunts us for a time, and we glance at the shades and the shadows and the hauntings, which we can't quite grasp, and we think of how we will make an impression, how to make meaning of our lives, and how best to honor the memories of those we have lost. And so that's where I'll leave you in terms of the formal review. Thank you for listening, and I can take some questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Janna. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. I will come to you, and we ask that you speak into the microphone so that everybody in the room and those online can hear you. Yes.
I don't have a question, but I just want to tell you how fabulous that it was. It brought the book just back to me and made it even all the more wonderful. You did a fabulous, fabulous job. That's all I want to say.
Thank you.
Here in the front, yes.
I also appreciated the review, and I did not read the book. And I want to say that I didn't read the book because I read the New York Times review. And once it started talking about witch, I thought, I don't know if I'm interested in a witch story. So thank you very much.
Don't judge a book by its reviews.
I know. But I do want to ask you a question. Judging by the review, would you classify this as a book that's disturbing to
Oh,
readers.
yes. The question was, I'm not sure you could all hear, would I classify it as a book which is disturbing? Yes, psychologically disturbing in the same way that, I don't know, Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections is disturbing, or all of Philip Roth's works are disturbing, because you're reading about pain and trauma and the destruction of a family, and it's hard, but it's very powerful. And yes, I think the disturbances are the authentic disturbances, because he writes about disturbances, but they're things we can imagine happening and maybe we've experienced happening, make it all that more powerful, right? So they impact us. Yeah.
We'll take one or two more if people have.
I answered all the questions. But I do encourage you to read the resource packets that I gave, because, if you're wondering about who the author is or maybe some of those reviews, it's there. Okay?
Janna, thank you so very much for being here for your wonderful and thorough review. Thank you to all of you who've joined us either online or here at Beth Tzedec. As I said at the beginning, this is the final gathering for this year. We will resume in September of 2025. And please watch your emails for information before the end of June regarding the dates and novels for next year's program. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.